if you're trying to write songs for the piano or even just arrange a piano part for your song, and you've noticed that your piano chord progressions are not sounding smooth, this is the video for you. Because we're going to talk about one simple tip to help you write smooth chord progressions for the piano. The key to super smooth piano chord progressions is simply to pay attention to voice leading in your piano arrangement. So what is voice leading? Basically, it is considering how each individual voice or each individual note moves rather than just thinking at a more macro level where we are only thinking about how the entire chord moves. Now that definition may be a little bit confusing without some examples, so let's dive into an example. So in this example, we're gonna go simply from a C major chord to a G major chord. Now, if we're not thinking about voice leading, we may just think, oh, C major chord, G major chord. But that is not smooth at all, going from here to here. In fact, if we were to do a whole 1-5-6-4 chord progression in the key of C major, just switching chords without thinking about voice leading, we might have something like this. Now you may say, oh, that sounds fine, and it doesn't sound horrific, but it also isn't smooth at all. So that's where voice leading comes in. With that example, I was just thinking about going from one chord to the next, just assuming that I would have the notes laid out in the normal way, in root position. But with voice leading instead, we're looking at each individual note and trying to figure out what is the shortest distance this note can travel in order to get to a note of the next chord. So let's just pick on that C major to G major transition. So we're trying to get to a G major chord, which is comprised of the notes G, B, and D. So when we take a look at our first note of our C major chord, we have a C. So now the question is, what is the closest note that we can move that C to that exists in a G major chord? Because we're trying to get to G major. And really there are sort of two options here. We could either go to the D, because there's going to be a D in our G major chord, which would be that, or we could move down to the B. In this case, we're gonna select to go down to the B. So the first note is going from a C to a B. Now we have to look at our next note of our C major chord. We have our C, which we've already moved, and then we have our E. E is not in a G major chord, and we already have the B from a G major chord. So what note should this move to? Well, the closest note is going to be that D from the G major chord. And then finally, we have our fifth, our G, and a G obviously exists in a G major chord, so that one actually doesn't have to move at all. So to smoothly go from C major to G major, instead of going like this, we can go like this. Because this is still a G major chord. We've just changed the inversion of the chord so that we have the B in the bass instead of the G in the bass. So let's continue out our 1-5-6-4 chord progression, where we are now trying to go from a G major chord to an A minor chord. We have, I think, two pretty decent options here for smooth voice leading. We could either move from G major to A minor like this, or like this. In both of those scenarios, we aren't moving the notes very far. In this scenario, we have our B going down to an A, our D going down to a C, and our G having the biggest leap of all, going down to an E. In our second version, we actually just really move all the notes up one, because we're going from a 5 chord to a 6 chord, so we can just move them all up by 1. For now, let's just assume that we're going with the second one. So finally, we need to get from an A minor chord to an F major chord. So once again, we'll look at each individual note and try to figure out what is the shortest distance each one can travel to get to a note that is in our F major chord. So our F major chord is going to be made up of F, A, and C. And our first note we have here is actually a C already, so that one doesn't have to move at all. And then our next note is an E. We need to still have an F and an A to get to our F major chord, and E is super close to F. In fact, it's just a semitone apart. So we will move that E to the F. And the last note that we have left over is an A, which, lucky for us, is the last note we need for the F major chord. So a super smooth way to go from an A minor chord to an F major chord is simply to move one of the 3 notes. We're just taking that E and moving up to an F, and boom, we have an A minor chord to an F major chord. So let's go back to the beginning really quick. Given a basic 1-5-6-4 chord progression with no thought of voice leading, we have this. But instead, when we considered voice leading, we ended up with this. Or alternatively, we could have done something like this, which also has very smooth voice leading. Now, if we put that all together with a bass part, just to make it sound a little bit more realistic, let's see how it sounds with the before and the after. So as you probably can hear, that second one is way smoother and more natural sounding. So overall, the simple key to silky smooth chord transitions on the piano is simply to consider voice leading, to think about how do we have each note move as little as possible to get to the next chord. Or to make it even simpler and more specific to pianists, you could really think of it as, how do I get to the next chord by moving my fingers as little as possible? And before you think this is a lazy way to go, just know that voice leading is considered in all sorts of musical compositions. In fact, it's one of the main things you learn about when you learn music composition. If you're trying to compose an entire orchestra, you have to keep voice leading in mind. If you're trying to compose for a choir or even four-part harmony in the songs that you are composing, or just a piano part, we always consider voice leading in what we do because it creates smoother music that tends to sound better. So hopefully you found this helpful. If you did, something else you'll likely find helpful is my free musical keys cheat sheet. This cheat sheet gives you every note and every main chord in every major and natural minor key. So if you want to be able to write songs in key with ease without having to learn more advanced music theory, be sure to grab this. Thank you so much for watching. I appreciate every one of you. Talk to you in the next one.